The colonies fight for their rights. The French and Indian War. The French and English had been vying for dominance in Europe since the late 1600s, fighting three major wars between 1689 and 1748. Most of the fighting took place in Europe, but whenever France and England were at war, their colonies went to war as well. In 1754, a fourth struggle began. The First Skirmish. In the 1740s, the British and the French both became interested in the Ohio River Valley. Using the Ohio River and the Mississippi River, the French could travel from the St. Lawrence River Valley to Louisiana. British fur traders and land speculators who bought land to sell for profit were also interested in the valley. The French built a chain of forts from Lake Ontario to the Ohio River. In response, the British governor of Virginia asked George Washington, a young militia officer, to expel the French. As Washington's troops marched toward the Ohio River in the spring of 1754, they encountered a small French force. After a brief battle, Washington retreated a short distance and built a stockade named Fort Necessity. A little over a month later, a large French force arrived and forced Washington to surrender. Meanwhile, the fighting between France and Britain expanded into a world war. The Albany Conference. Even before the fighting started, Britain asked its colonies to prepare for war and to negotiate an alliance with the Iroquois. The Iroquois controlled western New York, land the French passed through to reach the Ohio River. In 1754, colonial delegates met with Iroquois leaders in Albany, New York. At the Albany Conference, the Iroquois refused an alliance with the British, but did offer some support. The conference also issued the Albany Plan of Union, a proposal developed by a committee led by Benjamin Franklin. The Plan of Union proposed that the colonies form a federal government. Although the colonies rejected the plan, it showed that some colonial leaders were thinking about joining together for the common defense. The British triumph. In 1755, British General Edward Braddock arrived in Virginia with 1,500 British troops. After linking up with 450 Virginia militia troops, Braddock appointed Lieutenant Colonel George Washington his aide. Braddock began marching west, intending to attack Fort Duquesne, a French fort. 7 miles from the fort, French and Native American forces ambushed the British, and Braddock was killed. Washington rallied the men and organized a retreat. The successful ambush emboldened the Delaware people, who began attacking British settlers in western Pennsylvania. For the next 2 years, the French and Indian War, as it was called in the colonies, raged along the frontier. Gradually, the British fleet cut off supplies and reinforcements from France. The Iroquois, realizing the British would probably win the war, pressured the Delaware to end their attacks. With their Native American allies giving up, the French were badly outnumbered. The British seized Quebec and took control of New France. The war ended in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris, which virtually eliminated French power in North America. Growing discontent. Great Britain's victory in 1763 left the country deeply in debt. It had to pay not only the cost of war, but also the cost of governing and defending its new territories. Many new policies that the British government adopted to solve its financial problems were unpopular in the colonies. The Proclamation of 1763. In the spring of 1763, Pontiac, chief of the Ottawa people, decided to go to war against the British. He united several Native American groups, and they attacked forts along the frontier and burned down several towns. They did so because settlers had been moving into western Pennsylvania in defiance of a treaty. British leaders did not want to bear the cost of another war. In October, King George III issued the Proclamation of 1763. The proclamation drew a north-south line along the Appalachian Mountains. Colonies could not settle west of that line without permission. This enraged many farmers and land speculators who wanted access to the land. Customs reform. In 1763, George Grenville became Prime Minister and the First Lord of the Treasury. Grenville had to find a way to reduce Britain's debt and pay for the 10,000 British troops now stationed in North America. Grenville knew that merchants were smuggling many goods into and out of the colonies without paying customs duties, taxes on imports and exports. He convinced Parliament to pass a law allowing smugglers to be tried at a new Vice-Admiralty court in Nova Scotia. Unlike colonial courts, where the juries were often sympathetic to smugglers, Vice-Admiralty courts were run by naval officers. These courts had no juries and did not follow British common law because Admiralty cases involved property, not people. Colonists objected, arguing that these courts denied their rights as British citizens. The Sugar Act and the Currency Act. Grenville also introduced the American Revenue Act of 1764, better known as the Sugar Act. The act raised tax rates on imports of raw sugar and molasses. It also placed new taxes on silk, wine, coffee, pimento, and indigo. Colonial merchants complained that the Sugar Act hurt trade. Many were also furious that the act violated traditional English rights. Under the act, the property of merchants accused of smuggling was presumed illegal until its legality was proven. The act let officials seize goods without due process, proper court procedures, and prevented lawsuits by merchants whose goods had been seized. In colonial cities, pamphlets were circulated against the Sugar Act that gave rise to the expression, "No taxation without representation." This reflected the colonies' lack of representation in the Parliament. To slow inflation, Parliament also passed the Currency Act of 1764. This act banned the use of paper money in the colonies because it tended to lose value quickly. The act angered colonies who used paper money to repay loans. Since the money lost value after it was borrowed, the loans were easier to repay. The Stamp Act crisis. Parliament then passed the Stamp Act, which taxed most printed materials. The Stamp Act was the first direct tax levied on the colonists. As word of the Stamp Act spread in the colonies in the spring of 1764, a huge debate began. A flood of editorials, pamphlets, speeches, and resolutions against the tax swept through the colonies. The Virginia House of Burgesses passed resolutions declaring that Virginians could be taxed only by their own representatives. Other colonial assemblies passed similar resolutions. By summer, a group called the Sons of Liberty was organizing demonstrations and intimidating stamp distributors. In October 1765, representatives from 9 colonies met for what became known as the Stamp Act Congress. They issued a declaration which argued that because taxation depended upon representation, only colonies' political representatives and not Parliament had the right to tax them. When the Stamp Act went into effect on November 1st, 1765, the colonies ignored it. Instead, they began boycotting all British goods. People substituted sage and sassafras for imported tea. In New York, 200 merchants signed a non-importation agreement, pledging not to buy any British goods until Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. Pressured by these protests, Parliament did repeal it in 1766, but also affirmed its authority to make laws for the colonies. The Townshend Acts. During the Stamp Act crisis, Britain's financial problems worsened. Protests in Britain forced Parliament to lower property taxes there, yet the government still had to pay for its troops in America. In 1767, Charles Townshend, now Chancellor of the Exchequer, introduced new regulations and taxes. This came to be called the Townshend Acts. One of the Townshend Acts was the Revenue Act of 1767. This act put new customs duties on glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea imported by the colonies. Violators of the Revenue Act had to face trial in Vice Admiralty courts. The Townshend Act, like the Sugar Act, also allowed officials to seize private property under certain circumstances without following due process. To help custom officers arrest smugglers, the Revenue Act legalized the use of writs of assistance. The writs were general search warrants that enabled custom officers to enter any location during the day to look for evidence of smuggling. Action and reaction. The Townshend Acts infuriated many colonies. In defiance of the acts, the Massachusetts Assembly began organizing resistance against Britain. In February 1768, Sam Adams at the Massachusetts Assembly drafted a circular letter criticizing the Townshend Acts to send to the other colonies. British officials ordered the Massachusetts Assembly to withdraw the letter. The Assembly refused. Furious, the British government ordered the Massachusetts Assembly dissolved. In August 1768, the merchants of Boston and New York responded by signing non-importation agreements, vowing not to import goods from Britain. Philadelphia's merchants joined the boycott in March 1769. Sam Adams also played an important role in organizing resistance to the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts in Boston. Adams forged an anti-British alliance of merchants, lawyers, and other members of the social elite with artisans, shopkeepers, and common laborers, all of whom worked together to protest British tax policies. In May 1769, Virginia's House of Burgesses passed the Virginia Resolves, stating that only the House could tax Virginians. Under orders from Britain, Virginia's governor dissolved the House of Burgesses. In response, the leaders of the House of Burgesses, including George Washington, Patrick Henry, and Thomas Jefferson, immediately called the members to a convention. This convention then passed a non-importation law blocking the sale of British goods in Virginia. The growing dispute between colonies and British authorities centered on the extent of Parliament's power over the colonies, particularly the power to levy taxes. In a 1774 essay, the British writer Samuel Johnson expressed Britain's view of the proper relationship between the colonies and the British government. He that accepts protection stipulates, agrees to, obedience. We have always protected the Americans. We may, therefore, subject them to government. The Boston Massacre. In Boston, riots sparked by the Townshend duties led custom officials to demand additional protection in June 1768. As a result, 4 additional British regiments arrived in 1768. Bostonians referred to the British troops stationed there as lobsterbacks because of the red coats they wore. Crowds constantly heckled and harassed the troops. On March 5, 1717, a crowd of colonists began taunting and throwing snowballs at a British soldier guarding a customs house. His call for help brought Captain Thomas Preston and a squad of soldiers. In the midst of the tumult, the troops began firing into the crowd. According to accounts, the first colonial to die was a man of African and Native American descent known as both Michael Johnson and Crispus Attucks. When the smoke cleared, 3 people lay dead, 2 more would die later, and 6 others were wounded. The shootings became known as the Boston Massacre. Colonial newspapers portrayed the British as tyrants who were willing to kill people who stood up for their rights. News of the Boston Massacre raced like lightning across the colonies. It might have set off a revolution then and there, but only a few weeks later, news arrived that the British had repealed almost all of the Townshend Acts. Parliament kept one tax, a tax on tea, to uphold its right to tax the colonies. At the same time, it allowed the colonial assemblies to resume meeting. Peace and stability returned to the colonies, but only temporarily.